Boy, are you in for a treat. This is one fantastic program. It is truly the pleasure of Group 4 and myself in particular to present this program to you. It will provide you an opportunity to transport back in time some 40 years and allow you the special experience to be an eyewitness to history. Now, a program like this doesn't just come together. It requires a great deal of effort and work. You've already heard the names of our Group 4, and I share very much the pleasure and pride with them of presenting this program. But in particular, one person from the group worked very hard with the panelists and on the video that you will see, and that's Heather Pertula. So I would ask Heather to stand back up, and please give her a round of applause. When I saw her get her certificate, meaning she was leaving, I figured she was pretty happy about that. I also very much want to thank Greg Glass and Point Multimedia. They have given dozens and dozens of hours to make this program the spectacular one that it is. All the cameras that you see, the lights, the video, everything, that is Point Multimedia. I've gone ahead and put out their brochures on your table. Please read them. Please use them. They are wonderful to work with. So please, where is Greg? Let's see. There's Greg right there. Please give him a round of applause. And I also want to echo what Fred had to say and thank the great help we got from the Center for American and International Law. Mark Smith, who you know very well, we thank so deeply. But in addition, Pam Hooper and Sue Bliss were of immeasurable help. I don't know if they're out here or not, but please give them a round of applause as well. And finally, at the back of the room from the 6th Floor Museum, Michael Cheever helped make this program a reality. And I think each of you will agree that the program was greatly enhanced by our being able to have it in this very great space. So thank you, Michael. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to my partner, my friend, my mentor, George Bramblett. The history of this program is that a year ago, I was chairing the Bench Bar Conference, and we were sitting around and trying to think what would be a good idea for a program for Bench Bar, and George came up with this program, and it has just been a top 10 hit, and so this is literally the 4th time it's been presented, albeit it changes a little bit each time we present it. I think George is well known to you as an outstanding trial lawyer in Dallas. He has received multiple awards, but I think the one that says it all is that he has received the Trial Lawyer of the Year award from the Dallas Bar Association. And here today, he will present some of his personal reminiscences along with those of our great panel. So please welcome our panel and George.
Thank you, Nina. Gosh, what an honor it is to be here tonight with you, and I hope you enjoy the program. This past November marked the 40th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy here in Dallas. And today and tonight, our panel will discuss the aftermath of that historic and tragic event and the implications to the legal community, which you're a part of. We will attempt to explore issues such as why was Dallas called the city of hate and the city of shame? And was that deserved? Was the Jack Ruby trial that followed all of this really the trial of the century as was advertised? And what are the lessons that we can learn as lawyers and judges about the implications of this tragic event? We have a distinguished panel here tonight, and they include Judge Barefoot Sanders, federal judge who at the time in 1963 was the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Texas. Lewis Nichols, who at the time in 1963 was the president of the Dallas Bar Association. To my immediate right, Judge Joe B. Brown Jr., whose father, Joe B. Brown Sr., was the presiding trial judge in the trial of Jack Ruby, and Phil Burleson Jr., whose father, Phil Burleson Sr., was one of the 3 defense lawyers for Jack Ruby who stayed on with the case and who was singularly responsible for the reversal of the conviction of Jack Ruby in the trial. And again, special thanks to Heather. You've already been acknowledged for all your great work. And again, I would like to acknowledge Point Multimedia, Greg and Matt, again, for all your great work. They do a terrific job, and I can't tell you how much their efforts have meant to us. So thank you again. The assassination occurred, of course, on Friday, November 22, a date that we will all remember. Oswald was arrested that same day, you'll remember. The next day, the very next day, on Saturday, Lewis Nichols met with Lee Harvey Oswald knee to knee in his cell in the city jail area. One of the last persons to see and visit with Lee Harvey Oswald, other than his family, was Lewis Nichols. Lewis, how did that happen? Why don't you just sit there, Lewis? Why don't you just, yeah.
Thank you, George. Ladies and gentlemen.
Put that up a little bit closer, Lewis.
As you know, I've been asked to recall for you events that occurred more than 40 years ago. For a person my age, that presents two problems. One is trying to remember what happened 40 years ago, and the other is find you're remembering things that didn't even happen. So what I'm going to try to do is to tell you what happened in November 40 years ago as I remember it today. And it may or may not be the way it actually happened. Now, how did I get involved in this? On Saturday afternoon, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I received a telephone call from a lawyer friend of mine, and he said, "Does Lee Harvey Oswald have a lawyer?" I said, "I don't know." I said, "Why are you asking me?" He said, "Well, he had received a telephone call from a lawyer up in the East who was the dean of a law school, and the media up there was saying that Lee Harvey Oswald could not get a Dallas lawyer to represent him." He said, "What do you know about it?" I said, "I don't know anything about it." He said, "Well, that was related to him, and if he doesn't have a lawyer and asks for a lawyer, will you or the bar do anything about it?" I said, "I don't know. I didn't know I was supposed to do anything about it." I said, "I'll look into it." That seemed to be the perfect answer when I didn't know what I was doing. So I said, "I'll get back in touch with you." And not practicing criminal law, I didn't really know what the law was with regard to appointing a lawyer to represent defendants in criminal cases. So I called a lawyer friend of mine, asked him if he could tell me what the law was with regard to appointing attorneys to represent the accused in criminal cases. He said, "Well, the law in Texas was at that time that after a person had been indicted and it came to the attention of the judge, that the judge would appoint a lawyer to represent him if he didn't have a lawyer. But since Oswald had not been indicted at that time, there was no obligation to provide him a lawyer, and therefore there's no obligation to do anything." I thought, well, that solved my problem. Really didn't, though. And keep in mind that 1963 was before the Miranda case came down. It was before the Miranda case was a case when the Supreme Court laid down the ground rules that says if you're being arrested and being interrogated and you want a lawyer, you've got to provide one for you if you can't provide your own. And the accused doesn't have to say anything unless his lawyer is present. We did not have that ground rule, so I really didn't know what I was doing. And so I thought since he had no legal obligation to appoint a lawyer, there's nothing for me to do or the bar to do. Well, about 20 minutes later, I got another phone call from another lawyer friend of mine. He says, "Lee Harvey Oswald got a lawyer." I said, "I don't know whether he's got a lawyer or not." He said, "Well, I got a call from a dean of a law school up east. There's a different dean, different law school." And he said he understood that Lee Harvey Oswald could get a lawyer. What did I know about it? I said, "I don't know anything about it." He said, "Well, if you can't get one, will you or the Bar Association do something about it?" I said, "I didn't know I was supposed to do anything about it." But I said, "I'm looking into it, and I'll make some inquiry and see what." So I did make some further inquiry. I thought that since there was no legal responsibility, the Bar Association or I in the division had nothing to do about it. So I thought, well, I called Henry Wade, who was district attorney, and asked him whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald had a lawyer. I called Henry and got him on the phone. I said, Lee Harvey Oswald have a lawyer? He said, I don't know. I said, well, I'd been told he didn't have one, couldn't get one. I thought you might know. He said, well, I've not been up to the city jail, and I really don't know what's going on up there, except what I hear from my people. But says, I'm going up there tonight, and I'll find out. I'll talk to my people, and if Oswald doesn't have a lawyer or asks for a lawyer, wants a lawyer, I'll tell him of our conversation. And I said, well, that's fine. Let me know. And by that time, I had been thinking about the situation, having a man in jail. It was a very emotional period of time, and that he had some constitutional rights that were entitled to be protected. And that even if there was not a legal obligation to provide him a lawyer, maybe the Bar Association ought to look into it. And then with that, I called Glenn King, a captain in the police department, who was the chief's administrative assistant. I called Glenn to identify himself. I knew him from time past. I said, Glenn, does Lee Harvey Oswald have a lawyer? He said, I don't know. He said, no one has appeared up here, as far as I know, saying they represented him. And so far as I know, he has not asked for a lawyer. He's not asked for the right to call a lawyer. And I don't know whether he has one or not. I said, well, if you find out that he doesn't have one and wants one and needs one and can't get one, tell him of our conversation and tell him that I, as president of the Bar Association, would get a lawyer for him. I said that, and I really didn't know whether I could do it or not, but I thought I could. He said, well, I'll throw it back to you. You just come up here and tell him yourself. I said, well, I'm not sure I want to do that. I said, well, if I decide to come up there, I'll come by and see you. He said, well, do that. And so I thought about it a little bit. Got another phone call from a professor out at SMU, I think it was Charlie Galvin. He said, what are you doing about getting Lee Harvey Oswald a lawyer? I said, I ain't doing anything. I didn't know I was supposed to do anything. He said, well, I hear that he doesn't have a lawyer and can't get a lawyer, and I think you ought to go up there and talk to him. He didn't say we ought to go up there and talk to him. He said, you ought to go up there and talk to him. I said, well, I didn't know whether I wanted to do that or not. I hadn't made up my mind what I was going to do, but I'll think about it. And the more I thought about it, I decided nobody I'd talked to knew whether he had a lawyer or was asking for a lawyer or could get a lawyer. And so I decided nobody else was doing it. Maybe that was my job as president of the Bar Association. So I just decided maybe I ought to do it. So I changed clothes and went up to City Hall. And I looked for Glenn King, and he wasn't there. And I went in the chief's office, and he saw me coming in. And he court-martialed me and introduced me to some FBI officers there. He said, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm looking for Glenn King. I'm president of the Bar Association. I had talked to him earlier about Oswald having a lawyer or not having a lawyer. And he asked me to come up here, and the chief said, well, I'll take you up and show him to myself. I said, okay. And so we started up to the next floor, and he said, where do you want to talk to him? I said, doesn't make any difference to me. I just want to talk to him, find out whether he has a lawyer or wants a lawyer or needs a lawyer. So we went out into the corridor, and the corridor was just jammed with the news media, cables running. They had taken over the third floor of City Hall, practically. Got on the elevator and went up to the fifth floor, or sixth floor, I've forgotten now for sure. And she said, where do you want to talk to him? I said, well, it's any place. I just want to find out what the situation is with regard to whether he has a lawyer or wants a lawyer or needs a lawyer. So we went up to another floor, I believe it was the sixth floor, and got off the elevator and went into a room where there were 3 cells. And there's an officer sitting outside the center cell, and there was somebody in the center cell, and the other 2 were empty. So the chief had him open the door, and he introduced me. That was Lee Harvey Oswald was in that center cell. And he introduced me to him and said that I was president of the Bar Association and come up to see what the situation was with regard to a lawyer. And with that, he opened the door. I walked in, he locked the door and walked away. There I was. And so I reintroduced myself to him and asked him if he had a lawyer. And he said, I don't know what this is all about. I was incarcerated and held incommunicado, and I don't know what this is all about. I said, well, I understand that you've been arrested for shooting the president. And that's the reason you're here, and I want to know whether you have a lawyer, or need a lawyer, or want a lawyer. He said, well, he didn't respond to my inquiry about whether he had shot the president or not. I just made that, I said, I understand that's why you're here. And I didn't mention he shot J.D. Tippett, a police officer, that same day, or the day before. And he said, well, do you know a lawyer named John App in New York City? I said, no, I don't know him. He said, well, I'd like for him to represent me. I said, well, I'm sorry, I don't know him. He said, well, do you know a lawyer who's a member of American Civil Liberties Union? I said, no, I don't. He said, well, I'm a member of that organization, and I'd like a lawyer who's a member to represent me if I can. And I said, no, I don't know any who belongs. He said, well, if I can find a lawyer who believes as I believe and believes in the thing I believe in and believes in my innocence, and he paused a minute and he said, as much as he can, I might let him represent me. And I said, Mr. Oswald, what I want to know is you want me to provide you a lawyer or get you a lawyer right now? He said, no, not right now. Maybe next week. If I don't get these other guys, I may call on you next week. I said, now let me make this clear to you and make it clear to me. Do you want me or the Dallas Bar Association to get you a lawyer right now? And he said, no, not right now. Maybe next week if I call you, or you can come see me. And I was satisfied he knew what I was talking about. He knew what he was saying, and that he turned me down flat. And with that, I said, well, thank you very much. I went over and banged on the door, and they let me out of the cell. And as we were walking out, the chief said, well, I'm glad you came up here. At least the question won't come up about us denying him an opportunity to have a lawyer. And he said, incidentally, do you want to speak to the media? And I said, I don't know whether I want to or not. I don't know whether it's a thing to do or not. And he said, well, you're going to have the opportunity. They're going to be right outside the door. And we opened the door, and there they were, and I think we have a slide.
First clip. I
decided that I should come down and make inquiry as to whether or not he was represented by counsel, whether or not he desired to be represented by counsel, and whether or not he would ask the Dallas Bar Association to furnish representation to him. I have just visited with him in his cell, and he advises that his first preference is that he be represented by a lawyer in New York, whose name I believe is John Abt, A-B-T. He then stated that if he could not be represented by that individual, he would like to have a lawyer who was a member of the American Civil Liberties Union represent him. He said that if he was unable to get anyone from that organization, why then he might call upon the local bar association to represent him. I asked him whether or not at this time he was asking the Dallas Bar Association to do anything toward representing him, and he advised that he was not, that he did not desire that we take any steps toward obtaining representation for him, and that if he was unable to obtain the other representation, he might at a later time ask us to do so, and did ask that I would check back with him at a later time to see whether or not there would be any necessity or desirability that we attempt to furnish representation for him. Having contacted him and satisfied myself that he was not being deprived of representation by an attorney, and having satisfied myself that he did not desire to be represented by a Dallas attorney, I then left, and that's the situation as it exists right now. My name is H. Louis Nichols, L-O-U-I-S-N-I-C-H-O-L-S.
Did you talk about anything else other than the...
He didn't discuss the details of it. I did not ask him anything. He appeared to me to be perfectly rational, and I could observe no abnormalities about him at all in the short time that I visited with him.
What do you know about John App?
I don't know anything about him.
Are you going to try to contact that?
No, I'm not.
What did he say? What is that lawyer?
He didn't say.
He didn't say, he didn't give any reason.
He didn't give any reason. I didn't ask him.
Well, who's going to try and get out?
I don't know.
How long were you waiting?
About 3 minutes.
Did he say how he was trying to contact Mr. App?
He said he had talked to members of his family this afternoon and they would endeavor to get in touch with Mr. App.
What was his mood when he talked to Mr. Nichols? Did he seem... was the second choice?
He said he was a member of that organization and would like to have a lawyer who was a member of that organization represent him.
Does he personally know App?
I don't know.
How would you describe his mood? Is he calm?
Well, he appeared to be calm and...
Is he defiant?
I didn't understand you.
Is he defiant?
Defiant? He did not appear to be defiant. He discussed the matter with me in a very rational way and very calm way, and we discussed the matter, and I satisfied myself that he knew what he was talking about and didn't desire my services or the services of any member of the Dallas Bar Association.
Does he fully understand the charges against him?
I don't know.
You didn't discuss it?
I did not discuss the charge with him.
As a lawyer, do you feel the fact that he does not have one here would hurt the prosecution's case?
I do not believe so, since he is not asking for a lawyer to represent him at this time.
You think it's possible to get an impartial jury?
Probably. In Dallas it is.
The question was asked, may I ask it again, is it possible for this man to get an impartial jury? Would you answer that again, please?
Well, in my opinion, it is.
You think he can get a fair trial in Dallas?
I think he can get a fair trial in Dallas.
Do I understand, sir, that you and the Bar Association will help him get an attorney only if it is not Mr. App or the ACLU? In other words, if it is a Dallas attorney. Is that correct, sir?
Well, I have no control over any other attorney. I have no control over any attorney except myself. It is the feeling of the Dallas Bar Association that an indigent defendant should be represented. And one of the programs of the association is to furnish lawyers to represent defendants in criminal cases who are unable to provide their own attorneys.
Have you had any calls from anyone in your organization about handling this case?
I have had some inquiry about whether or not there were any Dallas lawyers representing this man, and I made inquiry and determined that apparently there are none at this time. He hasn't requested any representative.
Is the Dallas Bar Association the integrated bar that is part of the Supreme Court?
It's a voluntary bar association. The State Bar of Texas is the integrated bar. The Dallas Bar Association is a voluntary association.
Does the representation of indigent people include communists? Has a communist ever been so represented in Dallas?
I don't know.
Did you mention anything about his financial means?
I did not. I merely asked him whether or not he desired to have an attorney appointed by the association to assist him, and he said no.
Were these calls from people in the attorney profession, or were they from citizens? Really?
They were other lawyers that I'm acquainted with.
They were anxious to...
No, so they made inquiry as to whether or not the Dallas Bar Association was doing anything to see whether or not this man could obtain local representation, and I decided I'd find out.
Were these local members who called?
Would be willing to represent him?
I have not talked to any attorneys at all about it.
Would you be willing to represent him?
I do not practice criminal law and have never tried a criminal case, so I don't know the answer to that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Well, you know the rest of the story. The very next morning, Lee Harvey Oswald was being transferred to another jail, and he was murdered by Jack Ruby, which leads us to the Jack Ruby trial. The Jack Ruby trial was arguably the most important and interesting trial in the history of Texas, but certainly in Dallas. This was the first time in history that a person was murdered, to my knowledge, live on television with a whole lot of people watching. This was also the first time that a jury verdict was returned live on television, and we have the clips to prove it. So now, ladies and gentlemen, taking you to the next day, that Sunday, that fateful Sunday, for the transfer.
Basement floor of the Dallas City Hall, and that's a scuffle on the basement floor. It seems to concern photographers. He has been shot. Lee Oswald. We're going to switch now.
So I know all of you are asking, well, I understand why the other panelists are here, but George, why are you on this panel? How did you get yourself involved in this? Well, it just so happens that in 1963, I was a first-year law student. I wanted to be a trial lawyer, and the trial of the century was happening right here in Dallas, Texas. So I decided with some of my classmates to attend. If you could roll the next one. I learned that this particular Friday, which is a good day to play hooky from law school, was the first day that little Lil Bennett, the stripteaser, was going to testify. She was the one that Jack Ruby had sent money to right before he assassinated, or right before he shot Oswald. So while I was queued up in line, it is in the courtroom right across from Nikki DeShazo, where she has her court right now. It's the old ceremonial courtroom. I was standing in line to the top of the room, and at that moment, the infamous 7-man jailbreak took place. Many of you may not remember it, but it was a big deal at that time. This was the front page article in the Dallas Morning News with a photograph, and that's me up at the top against the wall saying, "Oh my goodness, don't shoot me." This headline prompted one of the New York dailies to say, "Dallas, oh Dallas." This was the first of many Forrest Gump-like appearances in my career. And just to prove the point, here's a short footage of the jailbreak. The jailbreak, in many ways, became a metaphor for all that was wrong with the trial and all that was wrong in Dallas. Let's roll very quickly this footage.
Somebody says he's got a gun, get back. And everybody ducked in that room. We were along this wall here, and there was no place to duck, so we just stood there. And this man came down the hall here, around the corner, with the woman. And I at first thought that he was an officer that had a woman in custody.
Did anybody here in the line down the hallway seem to panic or anything along those lines?
No, we were all sort of in a daze. When he told us to get back against the wall, we did so. We were just watching with our eyes wide.
To a certain extent, the image of Dallas as the city of shame was focused because of an event like this. To imagine a 7-man jailbreak in which they come in front of the courtroom, in front of the nation's press during a trial of the century was just, you just can't make this stuff up. As it turns out, this guy goes down the street in front of the courtroom, and a deputy jumps off of a car, wrestles him to the ground. The nation's press following him, I was following him. Many people said, well, that's your 15 minutes of fame, and I said, no, it's about 9.5 minutes. But it was a very interesting event, and unfortunately became, as I said, a metaphor for all that was wrong with the trial and the circus-like atmosphere. Judge Sanders was an adult at the time. To me, it seemed pretty interesting. Judge Sanders, these were very daunting times. Could you describe the atmosphere in Dallas during this time?
One might say they were really parlous times, to use an old word. I want to add one thing to what Lewis said. By the time he called me that Saturday afternoon, he got a little more aggressive. He said, "What are you doing about getting Oswald a lawyer?" As you see, it changed his tone. I said, "I'm not doing anything. What are you doing?" And that then he grumbled and hung up and went away. I think it's important to understand the situation in Dallas at that time to know a little bit of what went on before. I was asked recently what was the mood in Dallas, and I said mine was, what the hell is going on in this town anyway? Because it had been, you look at it, we had had the president was shot, Officer Tippit had been murdered, there had been literally a horde of media from abroad as well as nationally and coming in from all over the world, impossible for Chief Curry to control. And then the shooting of Oswald as Ruby ankled down in the ramp at the jail and plugged him right there. And all of that, I think, created a feeling of severe unease in the community, at least even though we were just on the fringe of it, the U.S. Attorney's Office. I certainly felt that way. We had become known, I think, as a center for right-wing extremism, not because the community felt that way, because Dallas has always been a conservative town, but those who had the shrillest voices were popping off. And let's impeach Earl Warren, let's do this or that kind of thing. And they were commanding the attention of the national media even before the assassination. And then a month before the assassination, Adlai Stevenson was here, and he was heckled very badly. He was spat upon. He was hit with a placard. And visiting with him later on, I know that he was badly unnerved. It was a very scary occasion, really. I do recall that Stanley Marcus was the only member of the business community at the time that spoke out about that incident that I recall. Then, of course, the assassination came. A lot of us were very concerned about the president coming to Dallas. An advanced person came through and came to see me. I'd been the director of the Kennedy-Johnson campaign in 1960. And I said, I sure don't think he ought to come to Dallas. Well, you can see that didn't amount to anything because he was scheduled here anyway. Then the vice president was coming to Dallas on the Tuesday before the assassination, and a friend of mine was one of his assistants. I said, I really would like to see the vice president, whom I knew. And so he said, well, he'd be coming out of, it was actually speaking across the street from the Trade Mart. Says, you jump in the car as soon as he comes out from making his speech and talk to him on the way to the airport, which I did. I'm not sure he was that happy to see me there. But at any rate, my main interest at the time, because the president was pretty well scheduled in already, was none of the people who had worked in the campaign were getting any invitations. And I knew Johnson would understand the problem with that. So I said, people are not getting invitations who did all the work. He said, well, how many do you need? I said, well, 100 would help. He said, okay, now what else do you need? I said, well, I don't think the president ought to be here. And he had that remarkable, persuasive way of turning to you and putting his nose right into your face. And it was a very large nose. And I've had that happen many times. And he said, well, I don't think he ought to be here either. And John Connolly doesn't think he ought to be here either. But I want to tell you he's going to come, and you better damn well be sure everything you can to have a successful visit. Thank you very much. Okay. And that was pretty much the end of that conversation. Got to the airport about then. He jumped on his plane. I jumped out into the rain from the car and came back downtown. Now then, there had been this horde of media that I mentioned. And I'm trying to give you the background of the situation as a community. Oswald, when he was arrested, looked like a sort of a left-wing kook. Obviously was, you could tell from the conversation with Lewis. And the irony was that, as it turned out, that we'd been concerned about problem coming from the right-hand side of the road, and it came from this kook from the left. And then we come to Ruby, who was a name dropper, a nightclub guy who ran a strip show operation. In fact, I talked to one of the security officers, I guess it was today, at the courthouse. And he said he knew Ruby. He was asking me what he was going to do, and I said, well, I'm going down here this evening. He said, well, I knew him. He said he was a name dropper. Said everybody knew him. Said he didn't think he'd do any harm to anybody. But said he always said he got in without any opposition, but the guy who was manning the ramp said he never saw him come down. But he's dead now, and you can't say any one or the other about that. The fact of the matter is, Ruby he wasn't really a joke, but he wasn't taken seriously either. He wasn't looked at as another potential assassin. And of course, once he was wasted by Oswald, well, there went the last possible link to disproving all these craziest conspiracy theories that have haunted us since the assassination. Was there a connection between Oswald and Ruby? None of it ever showed up. But he was indicted, as you know. He was tried. And there has built up over the years, and I think very unfairly, this media myth, almost to the point of fact, that there was an unfair trial, that he didn't have a fair jury, that Dallas was in sort of a lynch frame of mind. I saw an awful lot of people who thought Oswald needed killing. And I don't know that it would have been fair to say that Dallas was ready to lynch Ruby. In fact, Judge Brown, in his memoir, points out that he had heard people cheering when they heard that Ruby had killed Oswald. So it wasn't a lynch frame of mind. People who testified about getting a fair jury, two very prominent clergymen, Zan Holmes, Bill Holmes, two Methodist church prelates, and they thought he could get a fair trial. Stanley Marcus said, I really question whether he can. I was summoned to testify. I said, I don't think you'll ever know until you try to get a jury. That's the only way I know. Try to get a jury. It's just to summon a panel up there. And I think they summoned 162 people and questioned them. There was summoned about 900 and questioned 162 and then they finally got a jury. And the jury selection seemed to me to be fair. The problem in all of this was none of us was used to this idea of these people coming in from outside who kind of take charge, and brash as they could be, and no one was ready to be with security as we know security nowadays. And so it seemed to me that Reuben had a fair trial. I personally don't think he'd have gotten a death penalty if he had a different lawyer. And I think a lot of people around that time thought so. But this fellow comes whistling in from California with something called the Psychomotor Epilepsy defense. But then when Wade asked him, well, did Ruby know right from wrong? He said, I don't know about that. Well, that blew whatever there was to the Psychomotor Epileptic defense. Whatever that was, I've never found that or heard that then or done it since. But I wanted to give you very briefly and perhaps too sketchily somewhat so that the mood in Dallas was uneasy. I have never thought that it was all one way about let's all go get Ruby and lynch him, figuratively or otherwise. And the fellow had as fair a trial as you could get under the circumstances as they existed. And some prominent people thought that he would get it.
The verdict in the Jack Ruby trial was returned on a Saturday morning after 2.5 hours of deliberations by the jury. Judge Brown made the decision to allow the verdict to be broadcast live on television. There was one TV camera, CBS, pool coverage for the other networks. It's a fascinating video, the way people look, the way people dressed. Bear in mind, this is Saturday morning in Dallas.
About to receive the verdict in the case filed the state of Texas versus Jack Ruby. I want no sort of demonstration, no sound, no gesturing of any kind. Sheriff, would you bring the jury in, please? When I finish, everybody will remain seated until I officially discharge the jury and release the court.
The jury coming in, 4 women, 8 men.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have reached a verdict in this case. May I have it, Sheriff, please? We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder with malice as charged in the indictment and assess his punishment at death. Signed, Match E. Causey Foreman. So say you all, ladies and gentlemen. Is that your unanimous verdict? Will all of you whose verdict that is, please hold up your right hand. All right, Sheriff, your verdict. Keep your seats, please. There'll be no moving out. Don't let anybody out of the courtroom.
Judge Brown, your comments.
Well, first, I want to say what an honor it is to be here representing my father, who you just saw on the television. Now, he would be very proud to know that both his granddaughter and his great-granddaughter are in the audience tonight, and I want to take this opportunity to introduce them. His granddaughter is my daughter, Judge Mary Brown, and she's here with her husband, Charles Guylick, who is Charles Geilich is my partner in mediations. I approved of that advertisement. And the granddaughter is my little granddaughter. Oh, she's gone. Well, anyway, she's sitting right up here at this table. Her name is Juliet. Oh, she's back there. Her name is Juliet Waters, and she may be a fourth-generation judge for all we know. We hope so. In any case, I'll proceed to make my remarks at this time. What you have just seen is the only televised portion of the Jack Ruby trial that the court permitted. Having said that, let me back up and start at the beginning. My father, one of 3 Dallas County criminal district judges in 1963, presided over the Ruby trial because it was his October grand jury that returned the indictment against Jack Rubenstein, also known as Jack Ruby, for the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald. My father had tried a number of murder trials, but nothing that had drawn the media attention that the Ruby trial was drawing. His marijuana possession trial of the famous Dallas stripper Candy Bar attracted a lot of national media attention because of her ties to California mobster Mickey Cohen. Accommodating hundreds of camera people and journalists from all over the world presented the judge with staggering logistics problems. More than 350 radio stations, television, and newspapers and magazines from all over the world contacted the court for permission to cover the trial. Each of them wanted space for their reporters, camera crews, and seats in the courtroom. Of course, they all wanted to televise the trial as well. Now, the Bloom Agency, a Dallas public relations firm, volunteered to assist the court by handling space requirements of the press outside the courtroom, as well as the seating assignment of the reporters in the courtroom. This service was performed at no cost to my father or to Dallas County. As Judge Brown contemplated the media's request to televise the trial, he was mindful of the Billy Saul Estes case, which was tried in Tyler several months earlier. Television coverage was allowed in the Billy Saul Estes trial, and it had erupted in such a media frenzy that many argued that it had resulted in Estes not receiving a fair trial. And media coverage of the Estes trial was small compared to the international coverage anticipated in the Ruby trial. Of course, the problem was how to balance Ruby's right to a fair trial with the media's right to have the coverage that they wanted and demanded. Well, Judge Brown ruled that there would be no cameras in the courtroom, and that's why you will never see any film or pictures of the trial in progress. However, on the night before the last day of trial, my father was approached by his friend Murphy Martin, who was covering the trial for ABC television. And Murphy asked my dad for permission to have one camera in the courtroom for the taking of the verdict. He was able to convince my father that because of the national spotlight on this trial, that the verdict should be televised. He argued that the jury would have already reached its decision and that Jack Ruby's rights would not be compromised. So my father agreed to allow a lone camera to film the reading of the verdict on one condition. The camera was to be shut off following the reading of the verdict. Murphy Martin agreed to that condition. Murphy contacted the other networks, and it was agreed that CBS would furnish the lone camera and the operator, and the film would be fed to each network simultaneously. Well, of course, the camera kept rolling after it was supposed to be shut off, and you will see what happened in the next strip. Judge Brown thought the filming had ceased after he discharged the jury pursuant to his agreement with Murphy Martin. Court was recessed and Judge Brown left the courtroom. He did not know of the media circus going on in the courtroom until someone came into his chambers and told him that Belli was making a mockery of the trial in front of the cameras. At that time, Judge Brown ordered the courtroom cleared, but it was too late. Belli had already left his black mark upon Dallas and the Dallas County Courthouse. Well, my father's concern about television coverage in the trial was justified. He had not had the benefit of the Estes appellate opinion because it was not rendered for more than a year after the Jack Ruby trial. Actually, the Estes case was reversed by the United States Supreme Court, which found that television coverage before and during the Estes trial denied the defendant a fair trial. In light of that opinion by the highest court in our land, it seems that Judge Brown's decision denying the cameras in the courtroom prior to the verdict was appropriate and correct. My father was criticized for some by his handling of the Ruby trial. He may not have been as able a legal scholar as Melvin Belli, but he was one of the Dallas County's most experienced trial judges, having been an elected judge for 30 years prior to the Ruby trial. After the trial, and even after its reversal by the Court of Criminal Appeals, former ABC News anchor Murphy Martin stated that the handling of the Ruby trial was Judge Brown's finest hour. I must agree.
And now we'll go. And now we'll go to another clip in which we focus on the various lawyers in the aftermath of the verdict. And remember, as Judge Brown said, the comments by Melvin Belli were made in the courtroom. Melvin Belli was the self-styled king of torts. During the trial, some of the prosecutors called him Mr. Belly, which made him quite mad. But anyway, here is our next clip.
He would be satisfied with a long term because he knew that he hadn't proved the death penalty. This jury wasn't concerned even with listening to us in argument. They had their mind made up before argument started. Repeat this? I'll repeat this with every breath I have in me for as long as I live. And I'll stop practicing law if we don't reverse this and make these people in Dallas ashamed of themselves. Appeal. Appeal. Today. Railroad? This is a kangaroo railroad. And every one of you know it, too. I hope the people of Dallas are proud of this jury that was shoved down our throat. One juror, before he sat on that jury, told his employee that if he got on the Ruby jury, he'd vote the death penalty. Another juror waved at the policeman when they were on the witness stand. Her nephew does the public relations work for the police department. How do you feel about Judge Brown? How do you think he handled the case? Mr. Belli, your opinion on Judge Brown? He went down the line for every motion that the district attorney made, and they led him into some 30 errors. And every Texas jurist knows this thing was the greatest railroading kangaroo court disgrace in the history of American law. They disregarded your entire psychiatric case. They disregard every bit of our psychiatric testimony. They disregarded every witness who was sworn. And you heard last night when those jurors looked at us and said, we don't want to have any argument. We've had our mind made up. Now, that was the nod when the judge said you had to go ahead. They didn't even want recess. Why, in a civilized country in the heart of darkest Africa, you wouldn't argue a man's life starting at 12 o'clock in the morning. When I think we're coming into Holy Week and Good Friday to have a sacrifice like this, I think we're back 2,000 years. And the blight that's on Dallas, with those 12 people who announced the death penalty in this case, they'll make this a city of shame forevermore. And I'm going to participate in it too when I write this appeal. Mr. Belli, Mr. Samuel, your associate is in Texas. What's your reaction to it?
The violence miscarriage has been
No, we're going up and see him now. Said to come up and see me. He says that every time he leaves.
Did he say anything else? I mean,
No, I think that he didn't get the full impact of it.
were you surprised at the quick call this morning? Less than 2.5 hours of deliberation. Aren't you surprised at anything?
I'm not surprised at anything the jury did.
Judge Brown, there were 139 different objections raised by the defense counsel, were there not?
Yes,
Did you
sir.
accede to any of these at all?
Yes, sir. Some of them were good.
How many did you grant them?
Oh, I don't know. I think perhaps 4 or 5 out of 100.
Thank you. Mr. Bell has been making quite a point of this information, which a reporter told you that one juror made a statement.
Judge Brown,
Mr. Bell, I contended after the trial that you constantly ruled for the prosecution. I'm sure you had something to say on that, sir.
I really have nothing to say. Actually, it's you know what a struggle it is in the courtroom. Mr. Bell did his utmost to represent his client. So did Mr. Tonnehill. And I have no complaint of Mr. Belleye and Mr. Tonnehill. I think they're both fine lawyers. I think Mr. Belleye is one of the most brilliant attorneys that's ever appeared in my court. And I was glad to have him. And I think a great deal of him as a lawyer and as a man. And I have no complaint against Mr. Belleye. I think he's probably in the throes of an emotional state now himself. And I think he's a fine man.
Phil Burleson.
Thank you. I also want to thank you, George, for including me in this so that I can speak. I had many conversations with my father about this trial. I was actually, my birthday is November 22nd, so the killing happened on my birthday, and then with him being a part of the trial, obviously, is kind of a neat deal. One of the things, and I think George mentioned this earlier, he was the only attorney from the start to the finish of this case, and in fact got a reversal, and there was a new trial to be scheduled in Wichita Falls, so Jack Ruby ended up dying while he was in prison from cancer, but he died an innocent man, and a lot of people don't realize that. But some of the things I want to share with you real quick is some of the facts of the case and how Jack Ruby was present where he was and how it unfolded, at least as my father saw it. Number one, Jack Ruby was near the police station on the day that Oswald was being transferred because he was wiring money from the Western Union to one of his strippers over in Fort Worth to get her out of jail. And at the time, the Western Union was real close to the jail. So he just walked down. Because of his connections being in the nightclub business, he knew a lot of police officers. One of the police officers got him through in the back door. He just happened to be there right as Oswald was coming down. My father really believed it was a spur of the moment, doesn't believe it was premeditated, and just thought that Jack Ruby was caught up in the emotions, did not want to have Miss Kennedy have to come back to Dallas to go through the whole trial of this, and thought by assassinating Lee Harvey Oswald, he would take care of that. One of the things, and I'll mention it now, we sometimes answer in questions, why my father really did not believe it was premeditated is because Jack Ruby was a tremendous animal lover. He had a dog that he took everywhere with him, and the day of the shooting, his dog was in the car which was parked near the police station. And my father reasoned that if he truly had premeditated this and had it planned, he certainly would not have had his dog in the car knowing that that dog was going to be there for a day or days. So it turned out to be very interesting. One of the other aspects of this trial was when my father was with the district attorney's office, he was assigned to Judge Brown's court and was the prosecutor in there. And then after being there for a couple of years, now was primarily hired in the beginning because he had also been at the Court of Criminal Appeals as a briefing attorney to preserve the record for the appellant purposes. So it was kind of interesting. I know it was very difficult for my father to have to then be going and raising issues for a new trial going against Judge Brown because he had worked with him for so many years. So it was kind of an interesting situation.
Phil, your father was responsible for the reversal of this case. Could you elaborate on the grounds, the actual grounds, that the Criminal Court of Appeals reversed?
Well, it was on the change of venue, and I'll let one of the judges up here get into a little bit more detail about that. But at the time, there was not the change of venue that we currently have now. And ultimately, the Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that he couldn't get a fair trial in Dallas, and it needed to be outside of that. And In fact, Judge Brown has talked about this previously, and I'll let him kind of get in the change of venue that has changed.
Right. Okay. I'd like for all of you to comment and crawl out onto the grassy knoll, after all, the grassy knoll's right down here, and ask the question that's always asked about the events, and that is whether you believe or your father believed there was any connection, any contact between Oswald and Ruby. And I'll ask you, Phil, first, since your father was a pallbearer for Jack Ruby and was his lawyer through the entire event.
He thought there was absolutely no connection whatsoever. Again, thought Jack Ruby was caught up in the emotional aspect of it, but thought absolutely no connection.
Judge Brown.
What was the question?
About a connection between Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald, and whether or not there was any connection or reason why he would.
Well, I'll state my father's belief first, and then I can elaborate a little further on my belief. He believed that there was no connection and that there was no conspiracy. He believed that Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald for pretty much the same reason that Phil's father believed. He wanted to save Jackie from coming to Texas for a trial. Now, as far as any conspiracy about the assassination, I'll have to state my own beliefs about that. I was a justice of the peace during that time and participated to a great extent in the investigation that followed the assassination of the president. And it's my opinion that there's never been any evidence at all to suggest that there was any sort of conspiracy or any other gunman other than Lee Harvey Oswald.
Judge Sanders, you've already partially answered this about a connection between Oswald and Ruby.
None. I'm relying on the Warren Commission report. You know, they had I think 25 or 26 volumes. They operated out of my office for a few weeks before they got their own offices. And I haven't read this for years, but I know they looked very, very closely, very diligently into that possibility, and they said there was none whatsoever. So I rely on that.
Lewis Nichols?
I don't have an opinion about that because I don't have any information that y'all don't have. And without any more information, I couldn't arrive at an opinion at all.
One of the most unusual features of this case is the case went to trial, such an important case, based upon one single defense, and that was based upon insanity because of psychomotor epilepsy. And as far as I know, that was the first time this particular theory was advanced anywhere. Phil, could you comment on the use of only one theory in an important case like this?
Well, I do not believe that was my father's theory. He was not leading it. Once Mr. Belli was out of it, things changed. So I think you're right. I think that's the first and only time I've ever heard of that defense. Obviously, it didn't work. I think Judge Brown in there, or even Mr. Belli said in the tape that the jury didn't believe a bit of that evidence, and it's, I think, pretty obvious why.
Judge Brown.
Well, my father believed that Melvin Belli, who was not a criminal lawyer, he was the king of torts, a civil lawyer, very famous civil lawyer from, I believe, San Francisco, came down here to use Jack Ruby as a guinea pig and try out this psychomotor epilepsy defense, which, to our knowledge, was never used before and has never been used since.
Judge Sanders, what did lawyers around town think about the use of this one defense?
The only comments I ever heard, they thought it was a joke.
Lewis?
I mean, really, it's a serious joke, but a joke, not anything worthy of merit.
Well, there's an old saying among lawyers, if the facts are with you, stick to the facts. If the law is with you, stick to the law. If neither one with you, pound on the table. I think Melvin Belli was pounding on the table.
We welcome your questions, and before we go to your questions, I'd like to ask the panel one final question, and that is, was this really the trial of the century? It's a very important case, but are we right to believe in Dallas, especially since you participated your fathers participated, that it was the trial of the century. Phil?
Well, I'll start with my father. For the ones that are local, had some pretty good cases with Cullen Davis. He was involved in 3 of those cases. But as far as case of the century, I absolutely believe it was, and that's primarily because my father was involved in it. So I think it was.
Judge Brown?
I believe it was the trial of the century for Dallas County, for sure.
Barefoot?
Since I wasn't close to it, I really shouldn't say. I don't think it was the trial of the century. I think it was a very significant, important trial, but that's as far as I would go.
Lewis?
I don't think it was. I think if Lee Harvey Oswald had lived and been tried, his trial would have been a trial of the century. I did not think this one was.
Okay. Okay, questions from the audience. I know we're getting a little bit late, but we welcome any questions from you.
I'm going to go home.
Randy.
Judge Sanders, you talked about the attitude in Dallas at the time, and I remember even as a child when this happened that Dallas had pictures in the morning news of L.A. Stevenson being spit upon by women, dressed up to oppose him and assaulted when he was here, and articles in the morning news, and bumper stickers and billboards. The characterization of Dallas as a city of hate had a basis back then, in my opinion. But I'm just curious if you see major differences between the political attitude today, which seems to be getting more strident, and what was going on back then in the early 60s.
Well, looking back, I thought it was much worse then. I'm not going to take up for the way it's developing in some areas now, but I thought it was much worse then. Much shriller, much more extreme.
Any other questions? John? Well, I thought it was the greatest thing ever, especially being in the jailbreak. And I just thought it was terrific. And I'll tell you one story that I failed to tell you. After we went down in the street to follow the guy that had escaped and had the soap gun, we then lost our place in line. So we went back into the courtroom, into the line, and Melvin Belli came through. He had taken little Lil Bennett out to the car. And I stopped him, and I said, Mr. Belli, I'm a law student. I'd sure like to get into this trial. The trial didn't last very long. And he said in that Centaurian voice, he said, follow me, young man. So he took me in the courtroom. So I have kind of a warm spot for him, John. Real quick trivia question. Nina gave me this one. The caterer tonight was Campese's. What restaurant did Jack Ruby have his last meal before he shot Jack Ruby?
Egyptian.
Campese's. And if you go to Campese's, they have a Jack Ruby special. One member of your end's wife appeared in the Dallas production of Jack Ruby, All-American Boy. Jack Ruby, All-American Boy, and his wife was in the play. Who is it? Foster, are you here? Foster, stand up. Foster Reese's wife was in the play. Any other questions?
Did you know that gun was soap when you were chasing?
No, I didn't know it was soap. As I told people, the guy that made the escape, he must have been very good in shop because it looked like a real gun, and it looks like a gun on the. And also, there's a photo. There's a front page of the Dallas Morning News back there. Had another hand up.
How did Belli get involved in the case?
That's a good question. I think he made contact with Ruby's family. He was a very famous lawyer at the time. He was very persuasive. I don't think he had a lot of criminal experience, and I think he or none, and I think he convinced them that he could try the case, and I imagine he did it for very low fees, and he was discharged after the trial. The only lawyer that stayed in the case is Phil's father.
Tom Howard, I think, was originally rumored to be in it, but I think Belli edged him out.
Is that right, Philip? Yep. Yeah. Yeah, Pat.
I read that Henry Wade at that time had tried 42 capital cases. He was a verdict of death in 42 capital cases. He was going against a man who never tried.
Yeah.
One of the things that should have said, oh, Henry Wade was a former figure.
Right, and he had a formidable team, too.
He sure did.
He really did, yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you, panel, for a great event.
Good show. Yeah, thank you. Pleasure to be with you.